Last month, Democrat Socialists of America candidates beat Democratic incumbents in New York's congressional primaries. More than 36 DSA-backed candidates have won their primaries so far this year. 33% of Democratic voters want to see Democratic socialists in office, and roughly half of young Democrats support socialism. At a party for one of the winning candidates in New York, the New York Times interviewed a young voter who said, quote, "That trickle-down fear from our grandparents in the Cold War, I don't think that's really affecting anyone's opinion. They're looking at it from the perspective of, is this system working right now?" This voter is not alone. In the last 15 years, support for capitalism among youth aged 18 to 34 has fallen by 30 points. This demonstrates a major failure in education about socialism, communism, and the Cold War specifically. Here to discuss this with me today is Andrei Illarionov, the Center for Security Policy's Senior Analyst for Russian and European Affairs. Andrei, as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union and as an economist, what is your opinion of these latest developments?
I think it's both tragedy and catastrophe. It is tragedy for millions and tens of millions of those people who suffered from socialism and communism, from real socialism and from real communism in dozens of countries around the world, and suffered not figuratively but in real life. About 100 million people perished in communist experiments around the world. And this is a catastrophe for the United States. The United States has been created as a free country, as a country where freedom, where human rights have been not only respected and defended. This is the essence of America. This is the essence of the United States. And here, in the cradle of freedom, in the beacon of freedom for the rest of the world, the changes in ideas and in the public opinion are leading this number one country into the world into catastrophe compared, if this event will go to this end, to the same catastrophe that happened in Russia, in China, in Cambodia, in many other countries. So this is really this is the most tragic development of events that we could ever think about.
One of the you mentioned that 100 million people died from communist experiments, and Caitlin Collins, the CNN White House correspondent, has said that, well, the DSA is in support of socialism, not communism, and there's a difference. What would you say to that?
Everywhere, communists never said that they're going to organize concentration camps. They're going to organize famine, and they're going to exterminate millions of people. Everywhere they were saying, okay, we're going to have a socialism, and they're going to defend democracy. If you would read Soviet constitution or Chinese constitution, you would find it's fine, it's great. Cuban constitution, it's wonderful. If you listen to all this propaganda, it's exactly what we can hear from these journalists. Reality is very different, because it's internal logic in these socialist/communist experiments. The basic ideas to put everybody on the equal status from the state position leads the authorities, regardless what the ethnic authorities might be, to the same results and to the same conclusion.
I wondered if you could share a bit about your experience growing up in the Soviet Union. What was your childhood like?
The first thing that when you grew up in such a country, you do not fully understand where you are, because you're living behind the Iron Curtain, as Churchill said back in 1946. You just don't understand what is going on behind the borders of your own country, because propaganda from the early days explained to you that you are living in the very best country in the world. and everybody around them must envy you. And you just don't understand because you spend hours in queues to buy the just basic necessity, like meat. My mother, back in 1991, spent more than 10 hours in queue just to get 1 kilo of meat. And when she reached the point, so there was no more meat. It was finished. And you don't understand what's going around the world because you cannot travel outside your country because you need to get a permission from the authorities. And if you do something that authority would consider not right, so they would not give this permission to you. Moreover, you need to perform a special test whether you are a good communist or bad communist. If you are not good communist, if you don't know the names of all these leaders and all this communist theory and communist history, you would not be given this permission. You cannot read books and you cannot read what is going outside because there is a very strong ban for what people in those countries can read and watch, what kind of movies, what kind of literature, what kind of newspapers. And even today, where it's not full communism, what we can see what's going on both in China, in Northern Korea, and in Russia. So people are not allowed not only read, but to express themselves. What do they really think, and what is real their opinion about many things. So people in the West and people in the United States just do not fully understand and do not fully comprehend how to be in the communist, in the totalitarian society where you do not have basic rights and liberties that people here enjoy just even not thinking about that.
How do you figure, thinking back, if you started to notice something that seemed incorrect or not true, how do you figure out what you actually think if you're not allowed to express that to anybody else? Could you talk about it to your parents, or how dangerous was it to push back on what was being told to you?
Certainly, it depends on the particular period. For example, in the history of the Soviet Union, in the time when I grew up, I could have only so-called minor problems. What does it mean, minor problems? When I started to talk about some unpleasant so-called parts of the Soviet history in the school with teachers and with school children. So the decision was just not to give me chance to finish the school. Just very simple. And it was immediately reported to the local department of KGB. This is a secret police, a political police, that would take you yourself and put into special file. And when that happened, so these KGB officers immediately called my parents, to each of them, not to them, but to their work, to the offices where they did work. So they brought this issue not only against me, but against my parents. If that happened a few years earlier, so they might lose their job. And that would be a very different story. But if that happened a couple of decades earlier, they, with me, can go to the camp, to the not the pioneer camp, to the concentration camp. And many people just perish there because they express their views. My grandparents, so one of them just had a courage, or maybe he was not very accurate. He expressed his views about Stalin, and he turned out to be in the Far East in the concentration camp, where he died within a couple of years. So they just for the liberty to express his views about his leaders.
So just to clarify, if you ask a question or say something about Soviet history, when you were growing up, it meant that your parents would get in trouble at work. Previously, they could have lost their job or been sent to the Gulag just for asking a question about history.
About history, about the current political events, about his views on the political regime. It's almost guarantee to have a very, very serious problems. Once again, depending on the period. In the 70s and 80s, when I grew up, so I could have some kind of personal problems. Just it would be no progress in my career. I would not have a chance to get interesting job. I would not be able to join university and to graduate from the university. I would be fired from the university with no chance to come back. So it would be kind of relatively minor punishment. A couple of decades before, that would lead definitely to the very serious problem for my parents. They would be fired from the job. And a few decades, 4 or 5 decades before that, it would mean the concentration camp. So that's the reality of socialism/communism. And we do see the same approach everywhere, whether it's Russia or China or North Korea or Cuba or Eastern Germany or Czechoslovakia or Poland. Doesn't matter. So many people will think, okay, so just it's kind of the far remote Asian countries. They have different political culture or different history, and that is why they could fall in such a nightmare. No, it could happen everywhere, because this kind of system and the ideological system is such that it forces any ethnic culture, any national culture to be transformed into a totalitarian system.
And just from a practical standpoint, if you are rooting out anyone that asks questions, the people that excel would probably not be very smart, right? Like the people that rise to the top are not going to be the cream of the crop, so to speak.
So they are, in some sense, they are very shrewd because they understand the rules of the game. And so that is why they're trying to be, at least not at the bottom, so that is why they're trying to make their way to the top. And that is why they must be quite rude and quite aggressive against the compatriots, just to be there, because they would need to meet standards of the system. So that is why even initially some of them were not too stupid and not too bad, but the system forces them to evolve in monsters, just in order to keep their positions.
Going back to your grandfather who was sent to a concentration camp, what was that like for the rest of the family? Were they able to discuss it, to mourn him, or was it just like they had to pretend like nothing happened to not get in trouble?
For millions of people who have been sent over there. But for the families, this is also a catastrophe because they have been named enemies of the people. So it's not only those who happen to be in the Gulag, but the families. So that is why wives of both my grandparents have been fired from their positions, from their jobs. And they were, my one grandmother was not able to find any job until she was forced to worked with very heavy physical labor. And after a year and a half of this work, she died from the exhaustion on this work. For kids, if they would say publicly about their parents who happen to be in the concentration camp, it would be a very serious problem. They can be not allowed to school. So, and it's not something that it is allowed to be discussed, and even it would bring similar problems and similar hardships for the rest of the family. So it became taboo topic, not only in public space, but in the family space as well. And parents, just to save their kids or those out of parents or some kind of older brothers, older sisters, they were trying to some kind of to save and to protect their minors, not touching this topic at all. And for example, my own family history has become known to me only I grew up when I became already adult person, and when the political regime in the country was already a different one. And just parents could not allow themselves to talk with kids about that because kids could be not very disciplined and could share this family story with their friends, and it would be death sentence for the family.
So when you were younger, do you remember asking your parents about your grandparents, and what would they say?
Adult people would find some different ways how to just to avoid answering kids' questions. So, and just because kids, sometimes they're not very insisting, so they forget what they asked just before. But once again, you can come back to that issue and come back, and they would find another way and another way and another way. And after some time, you understand that, you would not get anything. So that is why there is no reason to keep asking about that.
What kind of toll do you think that took psychologically, and just to not be able to openly discuss things in a family and to have that kind of distance in relationships? What kind of, how do you think people were able to cope with it? Was it just pure survival?
On one hand, we need to understand if something is not discussed, it does not exist. And it is, once again, it's a psychology of people living behind Iron Curtain in the camp, but it's a big camp of the size of the country. And that is why you just don't understand what you don't know. And you're living in such a balloon in which many things look pretty nice, and you don't think about things that exist behind this balloon, because yet you just don't have any idea what exists behind this balloon. So, and for many people who are accustomed to live in such a situation, it became very pleasant and very comfortable, and they just don't think about that. And when someone would bring this knowledge to them, who would try to come from behind this balloon and just explain, for them is such a happening, there's such a psychological distress that they would prefer not to listen to that, not to know about this. Because, you lived, you grew up knowing, hearing from every angle that you're living in the very best country in the world. And the whole world is envy about your life because this is the best country in the world. And you don't have an idea about that. And all of a sudden, somebody or some kind of or book or newspaper or radio or some kind of group of people would explain to you, this is a terrorist regime, the regime that has killed millions of people, and people who deprives very basic rights and freedom from you, from yourself. Okay, and for many people, it's eruption. It's a kind of it's a uprising. No, it cannot be. I live in such a comfortable position, so that is why there is something not true, and the reaction could be very negative towards not towards regime that created this catastrophe, but again those people who trying to explain to you what is in reality. So psychology is a very tricky issue, and if some people are brainwashed, it's enormously difficult to come out of this brainwashed position.
What do you remember hearing about America and the rest of the world? If the Soviet Union was the best country on earth, what, in your mind as a child, what was America like?
Well, certainly in the school and in the public space, we have been told, all of us, okay, America is the enemy. America is enemy, American imperialism, they're trying to kill us, they are surrounding us with all possible methods and means, and they're trying to get our richness, they're trying to get our resources, they're trying to enslave our people, and so on and so on and so on. Fortunately, once again, fortunately for me, because I grew up in my family, and my parents, at least, they trying piece by piece to provide some basic information, and also I had a kind of the luck to listen to the foreign radio stations. Like BBC, like Voice of America, like Deutsche Welle. So that is why I had an alternative picture. And I, from the rather early age, I was able to compare what I see with my own eyes in my own country and what people on these radio stations were talking about the same events, about same facts, about same people, but from the different angle. And this was probably one of the most important universities for me, just to be able to compare, because the basis for education, for basic education for each person, is ability to compare. If you don't have an ability to compare real life, so you can end up just not understanding the world. Only you have if you have this ability to compare, so and maybe not for everybody, but there is a chance to develop this critical thinking about what you can see in front of your eyes and what have been told to you and what alternative can be.
Do you think that your parents, first of all, how common was it for people to listen to Voice of America? I'm assuming you could get into big trouble for that. How many people do you think had that kind of access?
It was not very usual. It was quite, and definitely it is not something that you share with your kind of friends in the school or just on the streets outside. No, that it was strictly forbidden. And fortunately, parents explained to me from the very beginning that just it is not something that can be shared with anyone. So that is why when my father and myself started to listen to these foreign radio stations, so we tried to do it in such a way that nobody would listen, nobody would hear that we're doing this, because it was very dangerous.
And do you think that, so both of your parents had a parent that went to the Gulag, right? And do you think that that started for them, that made them want to seek those information, those other sources out? Do you think that kind of disillusioned them to begin with?
For my parents, yes, certainly, because it was a family tragedy in each family of my father and family of my mother. But for my life, I knew many other, I learned about existence of other families that happened to be in similar positions. And I need to confess that not every family took same lessons and came to the same conclusions as myself and as my family. And I knew that many communist functionaries also have their parents and some kind of their relatives perished in Gulag, but it did not change their views. They became even more hardliners. They considered, okay, so communist leaders are right, Communist Party is right, so just my parents or their parents did commit something wrong. So that is why, once again, it's a very individual approach. It does not mean that always family values or family relations would prevail. In many cases, so they would support these communist ideas.
What do you think it was about your parents that made them different?
It's hard to say right now because we don't have the chance to talk to them now, but I would say that they're very, very intelligent, and they were very human-like people who have been educated and trained by their parents. Fortunately, they were maybe not too small when those tragedies happened with them. So that is why they had this chance to talk to their parents. And they were able to see, to talk to them and enjoy unique feelings of family life. And just to understand that. And when they have been taken out of families. So for them, it was tragedy, because it was the closest people to them. So, and that helped them to be alerted to all this official propaganda information that comes from official sources. But once again, not everybody was in such a situation.
They were both educators, right? What were their professions?
Yes, they both were teachers of different kind. My mother was a teacher of teachers who were working in kindergartens. So that is why she was teaching how these teachers are dealing with kids, small kids, preschool kids. So that is why it's a very special kind of way to deal with small kids. And my father was a teacher, it's called Methodist, so the person who was teaching teachers of Russian language. So he himself a specialist in the Russian language, and he has written several books on stylistics of Russian language. So he was working and just was explaining to school teachers what is the best way how to teach Russian language to school kids.
And what was your education like? You would become an economist. How did that come to be? How did you find an interest in that topic?
My father wanted me to also to study philology and linguistics, and I found, by the way, it's incredibly interesting and it's breathtaking, and I almost went that way, but I found once the old book on economics, started to read it and found it interesting. And the idea was just economics could explain the life. Philology could not explain the life, according to my teenager understanding. So that is why I tried to, and I went to the economics department of the university, and I graduated from economics department. And the first part of my adult life, I was doing essentially economics and only economics. And I think it's really one of the very interesting and very important subject, and I was able to do something in this area as well, both from theoretical and from the practical perspective. But after that, I found that in addition to economics, there are some other areas and some other subjects of equal importance, or maybe more importance, like psychology. We studied, talk a little bit about, and sociology. So, and the culture. So that is why. So I try to understand a little bit of each of these areas.
When you were learning economics, was it just Marxist? I mean, how did you learn about what was your coursework like?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So it was a Marxist economics. So, and just which is not economics. You need to understand. Okay, but it was exactly what has been given to us as students for during 5 years process of education at the university. Fortunately, we had some good professors who also were trying to give us some basic information about, first of all, life behind the Iron Curtain, about other ideas. One of the good subjects that we studied at the economic faculty, as economic department, was history of economic ideas and economic history of the world, which contributed a lot in understanding of the rest of the world. Once again, it was a very unique part of this education, and it was not widely shared with other students. But also at some point I came with great interest to international comparisons, maybe because of my parents. And in order to understand international comparisons, you need to have this information, you need to have data for other countries. And if you would try to get such books, they are forbidden, they are not available, and in the library, and even in the public library, you cannot get them. They were in a special department in which you could not have access. To get access, I tried to do it, and I needed to get permission from the head, not when I was student, but when I was adult assistant professor at the St. Petersburg University. I have written a letter which has been signed by the head of my chair, after that head of my department, after that rector of my university, and after that with this letter I was forced to go to the director of this public library, who should also sign this letter that would give me permission to come to this particular special room behind really iron door, in reality very, very iron door, just only for 8 hours in a day. You were not allowed to take this book out of this room. You can be only there, you can read this book only there, and you have a notebook where you can put your notes, but you cannot take this notebook with you. You must leave this notebook behind this door. Just to give you and to give our kind of our audience just to some kind of a little bit of understanding what does it mean. So that is why it's virtually impossible just to understand it. But there was one caveat in this system. Statistics, the books on statistics, like yearbooks or some kind of historical statistics, were not considered poisonous for young souls in the communist country. So that is why the huge hall in the public library in St. Petersburg were filled with yearbooks for each country, starting with statistical abstract of the United States, or yearbook for Norway or Sweden or Finland or Germany or France or Japan. So they just were publicly available. But who would read statistics? It's only numbers, with little bit very, very, very short footnotes. And for years I was coming to public library studied these statistical yearbooks with economic data with strange title GDP, gross domestic product. What does it mean? With price inflation. Interesting, because price was a forbidden word in economic faculty in Leningrad University back then. It was forbidden. Just for using word price, you can be fired from the university. Just people should understand. It was completely forbidden topic. So, and I had these kind of the long statistical rows of price inflation. What does it mean? And such issues like monetary aggregates, it was just nobody had an idea what does it mean. So, and I studied this stuff over there in libraries, trying to understand the real economics.
Did you understand, if you couldn't even say the word price, did you understand the concept of it? How did you figure that out?
No, the concept is a little bit easy to understand because life is life. So that is, you're meeting this problem almost every day, even in the Soviet Union. The difference between real life and what can be discussed and could be studied in official institutions like the university. I know that just one of my kind of friends, when it came the time of preparing diploma, as a kind of closing to the end of education, he has chosen the topic of price. He was one of about 100 people that has chosen. He was courageous enough to choose price. And when he came with this idea to professor said, okay, so would you like to be fired from the university without chance to finishing it or not? So he prefers to continue to study and to finish diploma. So he abandoned the idea to write a diploma on prices.
How difficult was it to get to that point, to be selected to go to university? How was that decided?
Fortunately for me, so you need to just to pass exams, serious. But fortunately, there was not much kind of political / ideological control, at least in my case. But you definitely would need to have a special letter from the either party, regional party committee, or some kind of Young Communist League committee that would say that, okay, this is a good guy. So he has been checked. Okay, so he's not an enemy of the people. So that is why he can be given a permission to study in at such departments like economics, history, and philosophy. These three so-called ideological departments. So that is why you cannot even pass exams over there if you do not have such a letter. So that is why I was trying to get a letter explaining that, okay, I'm not somebody who can be diverted by American imperialist or some other capital from the communist ideas. So, and that gave me chance to pass exams, and after that to study over there.
Approximately what year had you graduated? At what point was this in the Soviet Union?
1983. So it's next year after Brezhnev's death. By the way, 1983 now is generally and widely understood as the year at which the Third World War might be launched by the Soviet Union. And now we have a lot of documents published showing that, yes, exactly in 1983, the Soviet Union was preparing a big attack on Europe.
I did not know that. I want to come back to that.
It became known. So we in the Soviet Union didn't have no idea about that. So because we saw all these people in military uniform everywhere, just it was our life. But some documents have been declassified over the last several decades, and all of them showing that it was really a very high risk of launching the Third World War.
And maybe this is stupid, but why? Why were they doing that?
Oh no, because the communism is always just from Lenin's or Stalin's words. Communists can exist only if all the rest of the world will be communist one. Because this idea of comparison is a crucial one, because people could compare. If they could compare, that is why there is a very serious chance that communism would not pass the test. And some people would say, okay, there is a reality that are much better, nicer, more comfortable than the communist concentration camp. So that is why, from the very beginning, the idea is to destroy the something that with which communist countries, the communist world can be compared. So that is why this is the main idea lying behind the so-called World Communist Revolution, to destroy everything that can be used for comparison with the communist world.
And what prevented that? Was it Brezhnev's death, or what deterred?
Still not, probably there is no kind of final consensus about that. And by the way, because so that was not the world that we are living right now. It's not the kind of the social networks. It was no internet and so on. And the flow of information was much more limited. So that is why Soviet spies in the European cities, in the European capitals, were watching the windows of the buildings, official buildings, government buildings in London, in Brussels, in Paris, in Washington. And if they saw that there was a light late in the night in those windows, like for example in Pentagon, it means that they are preparing attack on the Soviet Union. And that is why, just not to be the last one, just to prevent this attack, so we need to attack first. I'm not joking, that's exactly the logic that have been used to explain why we are at the brink of the Third World War, and why we need to strike first. The light, late night, in the windows of whatever, Downing Street 10, or whatever, Quai d'Orsay, or Pentagon, or White House. So, because they are preparing attack on the Soviet Union.
Did the leaders believe that, or was that propaganda for the population to be afraid of the West?
As we kind of learned once again recently, when the documents became published, kind of the old generation of communist leaders did believe in it, like Brezhnev or Suslov or Ustinov or those guys. New generations, much younger generation, like Gorbachev, who came in 1805. So they were already a little bit different people. So that is why probably they did not believe in it fully. But as Gorbachev himself, as well as some other people of this younger generation have revealed later, at least Gorbachev was courageous enough to admit that he was so much ignorant about life in the Soviet Union first, and about the life outside of the Soviet Union. Even for those people who reached the top of political power, he not once he has admitted that he was so much ignorant that he did not have a chance to understand the real life in his own country and real life beyond the borders.
So going back to graduating college, and you're a Soviet economist, what was your first job, and how did you get a job in the Soviet Union?
Fortunately for me, I studied well, so I got one of the best scores in my class, and that is why I have been offered a position of assistant professor in my own university on my own economics department. So, in moreover, not for regular Marxist political economy that most of us were forced to go, but I was offered a position at a new chair that has been opened just same year. It was a chair on international economic relations. Once again, I was lucky enough because instead of giving lectures on whatever political economy of socialism, which is crap. So I was no. It's a fact of life. It's unlucky people who were forced to do it for many years because after that, just your brain it just is dead because you need to repeat unbelievable stuff. Okay, so just it's not good for intellectual health. So, but fortunately for me, I happen to be the chair of international economic relations, and it was the first time that St. Peter, back then it was still Leningrad, and Leningrad University had such a chair. So that is why I was had the privilege to study international relations between countries. For trade, all of a sudden I was allowed to talk about capital movement, about balance of payments accounts, current accounts, and so on. Because it's a very unique, very special position, unlike 99% of my comrades and colleagues who studied at the same place. So that gave another window of opportunity, and I tried to use it, and I started to do what I liked most back then, to do international comparison. And I happened to be the second person in the whole Soviet Union who learned about such a concept like national accounts and international comparisons using national accounts, or about international comparison project. There was one person, elder one, in Moscow, in the Institute of World Economy International Relations, Boris Bolotin, who was doing this stuff a few years before me. And I happened to be second person who had idea about this project, about this approach, and who understood at least basic stuff about the international comparison. So just once again, people must to understand how isolated the whole country, Soviet Union, back then had 280 million people. And for this huge country, only 2 people did have some understanding about the concept of international comparisons.
Given how controlled information was and how careful they were to prevent access to a book about economics, why did they not worry about the statistics? Like, why did that not concern them? Why was that available?
Because they did not understand it.
Oh, they didn't realize what it meant.
Not understand, because they because their level of education, level of training, and level of just the kind of the concept or worldview were so limited. They just did not understand that this is a kind of the heaviest weapon against them. And that is why they continue to buy these books, because the kind of public library in Leningrad, back then in Leningrad, now in St. Petersburg, was a so-called imperial library that has been created by Russian Tsars, Russian emperors back in early 19th century. And as a tradition, they were some kind of buying a lot of books around the world, as a just kind of the tradition. And all these political, ideological books were considered to be poisonous, and that is why they have been sent to this banned room that I was talking about earlier. But statistics, okay, who would care about statistics, about these numbers? And that is
They
why
didn't.
in
When you, having already started to listen to foreign radio and getting access to these statistics, do you remember what it was like to start to realize what it meant, and that it was it was kind of an information weapon that they didn't realize yet? Do you remember your thoughts at that time?
No, fortunately for me, because I had help from my father, first of all, telling me right away. So that is why it was immediately understood that, first of all, it is not something that can be shared with anyone. And this is a very precious kind of elements of information. And I need to cherish it. I need to cherish the access to this information. I need to cherish that information, especially that I had regular the confirmation that those who are talking on these foreign radio stations, they are right, and those who are talking here are wrong, because you could see with your own eyes. So just you listen, you can compare, and you can make your own conclusion. And that is why it's a very important element in psychological evolution of a person, because you can see two pictures provided by two sources of information, and here you are forced to kind of to follow official line, but you know this is the wrong one. But you know the unofficial line, which is the right one, but you cannot share it with other people. So that is why it sort of contributes to developing of a particular attitude, that you need to understand the reality, and reality not the same, and you need to be extremely cautious not to reveal that you know the other side. Because I had my own experiment when I was in a school, when I tried to talk about this openly, and it led to almost firing me from my school. So that is why having such an experience, I became rather cautious not to repeat this test again and again.
How taxing was that to try to keep things straight of, okay, this is what I'm allowed to say, and I know that's not true? How did you manage to do that?
It's difficult. It's not easy. And that is why you need to be extremely cautious and accurate in choosing those people with whom you can discuss it. You can discuss within your family. And once again, I'm lucky one because I could discuss these issues in my family. But there were some families in which you cannot discuss this stuff, because we had also many examples, and even just they have been taught in our schools, when kids went against their parents, and their parents have been sent to Gulag. And those kids have been praised by official communist propaganda. Okay, this is the way how to do it. And for little kids, this is a very serious challenge, whom to follow. Because in a school, you can be praised. You said, okay, you're a very good pioneer, you're a very good young communist leader, but your parents are wrong. They are just old, they are wrong, they don't know, they do not share. And actually, some kids were falling in such a trap. And that led to enormous tragedies in those families. Because they, maybe their parents were not some kind of attentive enough, or sort of not cautious enough, and that could lead to just family tragedies. So this is a worst problem. So you once again, I was lucky enough that I could discuss it with my family, but after that, you need to be extremely accurate in choosing other people behind your family with whom you can share some of this stuff, and slowly and gradually, step by step, just to see whether you can discuss with such a person this issue or another issue or another issue. And sometimes it could take years to develop these relations. And at some point you would find, no, you cannot go further because it's dangerous. You cannot trust such a person. And I can say that it's not only my own experience, it's experience of many people of my generation and older generation. Recently I talked to, for example, to Viktor Suvorov, the author of great books about the history of the Second World War that revealed the real preparation of Stalin for attack Europe and establishing the world dominance. And he told me exactly in the same words his own experience, that fortunately for him, he had good relations with his father, and evidently they could discuss some issues, not like in my family, but something. And when he had a very bad experience with his friend in the school, that led to serious problems for him. So, and he learned the same lesson, that you cannot share some very important information with anyone. You can keep it with yourself.
Yeah, I can imagine for the people who informed on their parents later on, if they started to realize a mistake, it would be too psychologically difficult to accept. So you would have to just triple down that you were in the right. Otherwise, the consequences of your actions would be too devastating, I think, to accept. You can kind of see how that would.
And especially, we need to say a word here about religion, because the traditional Christian families, this is a very important rule, that you need to respect your parents, and respect, and you need to protect, and there are special relations between kids and parents. In the atheistic society, in the communist society, religion is being destroyed and banned to study and to understand. So that is why one of the basic rules of human behavior has been banned. And that is why kids did not have an idea even about these basic rules for any Christian around the world. So for them, there was no even some kind of ethical limitation, what can be done, what cannot be done. They did not have any idea about that. And for parents, it also, for their parents who were Christians, because they either were born before revolution or right after revolution, and were growing up in more or less Christian families, for them it was also not understandable that their kids might behave in a different way, because kids did not get this Christian education. So that is why we need to understand what kind of blow have been given to this new generation who was deprived from education of very basic rules of human behavior that comes with basic ethical standards, ethical rules from Christian education and from exposure to Christian ideas.
Yeah, it's kind of tragedy upon tragedy. When did you learn about how many people had been killed throughout the revolution, the Civil War, and Stalin? Do you remember?
This is a process, so that we still don't know exact number. Yeah, but once again, fortunately to my family, to my parents, they were telling me from relatively early on, from my teenager years, that was millions. And young person just cannot comprehend these millions. It is a lot, but how much, just people do not understand. Only with time you're coming to, once again, slowly, step by step, you can come to understanding of this tragedy. And still, we still do not understand fully. And just even recently, for example, just in the time of this Russian-Ukrainian war, I studied on purpose the history of Holodomor, the starvation campaign that Stalin organized against Ukrainian population. And even I knew a lot about this stuff, but even today, after learning, once again, not getting to the full picture, but at least coming closer to the full picture, it's just unthinkable that for the nation that was before the First World War, before the Revolution, before Civil War, before Holodomor, Second World War, was about 40 million people. So 60% of this population have been killed. 60% through different tragedies that have been organized with heavy participation of communists. It's just unthinkable with that about what other nations would go through such catastrophe, because just not only some particular people, but families, villages, the whole district have been wiped out from the Earth's surface because of this policy. So that is why the whole worlds have disappeared, because they have been eliminated with a particular policies directed at destruction of a particular ethnicity.
And the famine that you're talking about, some people think that it was just a mistake, that the communist policies were bad, but it was a deliberate choice to starve those people, right?
To starve, to kill, to send to Gulag, to shoot, just it's endless, because the instruments to kill a human being are very much developed. They can be used en masse, especially for such a totalitarian regime like communist was.
So as you've studied international comparisons, what did you get to travel, or was that not allowed still?
Once again, I was lucky. I had my first trip to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a communist country as well. But in 1982, because I studied well, so I once was among top students. So that is why for those 10 top students, was given a chance to visit a brotherly socialist country. It happened to be Czechoslovakia, and it's good because Czechoslovakia, even that was a communist country, but a country with a different history, with different culture, which was much more developed, with higher level of living standards and so on. But when I traveled there, we crossed the border from the Soviet Union into Czechoslovakia, I was shocked. And I was just, the whole night that train was moving from the border to Prague, I did not sleep. I just watched through window everything that was here. From the kind of railway station that we came, just it was so unbelievable, different, interesting, attractive. And just these 3 weeks that I spent in summer of 1982 in Prague, and after that a little bit in Brno, and after that in Bratislava. So it was just enormous push for me for understanding Czechoslovakia and this international comparison. And each travel outside of the Soviet Union, I happened to be maybe couple more times before the fall of the Soviet Union, was enormously productive, enormously helpful for me to understand the rest of the world. Even just another one was Yugoslavia, which was also a socialist country, not fully socialist, but reasonably socialist country. So, and one was West Germany, exactly in the days of the Tiananmen massacre in China. So that is why we came to Hamburg in Germany, but we could not stop to watch TV screens. And it was West Germany when the TV screens were showing these students on Tiananmen Square, and after that massacre that communists organized and unleashed again those students on Tiananmen Square. So that is why, once again, it was given an opportunity to compare the life here in West Germany, in Hamburg, and the life in the communist country, in China. Just here. Just you don't need anything. Just you have this chance to compare.
What was the thing that stood out to you the most, that you were most fascinated by in West Germany?
People. You know, that just the most striking stuff that I found in Western Germany, and after that, when I had a chance to go to Austria to work there at the Research Institute, and after that to many other countries, and to the United States, it's just people. Not just, certainly, we can talk about kind of this GDP, which I study, okay, the living standards, about the achievements in many areas. Yes, they are very important, and just they're really sometimes shocking. But the most shocking stuff are people. Openness, tolerance, readiness to listen to other people, and readiness to understand other people, and readiness to come to help. I was in Austria back in summer 1991, just few days before the attempt of the coup in Russia. And we traveled somewhere in the wilderness. You can find even Austria, some piece of wilderness. And we stopped at the cross of the roads, thinking, it was once again before GPS, before all this modern stuff, and we just stopped just to think which out of two roads we should take, which way should we go. And the car that was just reaching us stopped right to us, and the person came out and asked, do you need help? Would you need to maybe you're kind of got lost, maybe we can help you to explain to it. It was absolutely shocking, because back then in the Soviet Union, you would never get such an attitude towards you.
Why not? I'm spoiled that I grew up in America. It's hard for me to think of what it would be like if people weren't friendly and eager to help you. Why wouldn't you have that happen in the Soviet Union?
Because the principle of isolation. And there's a full isolation. It's not only isolation of the Iron Curtain against the rest of the world. It is isolation within society. I was trying to explain that you cannot share some kind of political stuff or ideological stuff with somebody, but it's better not to be involved in the business and life of other people, and nobody would be involved in you, because it's dangerous. It is risky. It is sometimes deadly dangerous. And that is why just to stop at the kind of in the wilderness, who knows who that guys that are in this car and what they can do to you. It just nobody in the Soviet Union back then would do it, because it might lead to kind of enormous problems to you.
So everyone and everything could be a threat to you. So you just have to keep. So if somebody like walking on the street collapsed and passed out, here people would rush to help.
Passing, yes. When I happened to be in China in 1994, that was my first visit to China, to Shanghai. Just I was shocked by watching kind of hundreds and thousands cyclists. Back then, it was not yet too many cars in China. There was most of people using bicycles. And the cyclists, kind of hundreds and thousands of cyclists going this way, one of them falling. And hundreds and thousands of people just moving through him. Just not even making a little stop, not only just taking to coming to him, to taking care, or just providing help. No, just everybody is just moving, just as it does not exist. So, but this is probably most visible, but it is similar that we had back in the Soviet Union, but probably in more kind of accurate way. But the essence of the relations between people is the same. And that is exactly what a socialism, communism means. The propaganda, yes, it could be kind of for joint happiness or it's kind of joint efforts. In reality, it's a very different one. In the same story for so-called capitalism or the West or the market economy. So because we were told, okay, this is a kind of just animal society where everybody is trying to kill each other or to kind of to make fortune at the expense of others. And the most shocking stuff that have been learned by me when I happened to be there, how people are open and ready to help you in real life.
Wow. The complete atomization of people is hard to comprehend and one of the most devastating parts of, or to me, what it seems like. Just controlling every moment and thought of your life.
Yes, as we know, that just in the democracy in America, it was 1830s, the kind of the famous French traveler who visited young America was shocked to see how many different societies, groups, committees, organizations do exist in the country, and how everyone is included, not in one, but in dozens, if not hundreds, of different organizations, societies, committees, clubs, and so on. And certainly America is outstanding example, but some other Western countries are similar in this regard. So which makes this crucially different from these communist and socialist societies, which are atomized completely, and there is no social fabric, there is no social cohesion, there is no social interaction and cooperation to any extent similar to the Western societies, because such societies, communist societies, are much easier to manage, much easier to govern, and much easier to direct, either to to move to the east or to the west to attack other countries, or to use these human materials in any experiment that those communist leaders would like to do.
Yeah. Do you remember your first time to America? What year was that?
94.
94. We just had the World Cup in America, and there were many Europeans visiting and pointing things out that Americans hadn't really noticed, some of the benefits of living here. What was the thing that stood out to you the most in America in 1994?
But first of all, I need to say that it was already some time ago, and there is it's not all of them in the better side, in the better direction. So the country that I visited back then was slightly different from the current one. So, but it was very, very useful experience. And by the way, if we are talking not about what is maybe not shocking, but most surprising and producing most serious impact in the US. Certainly, I knew about economic power. I'm economist. I studied it. About military power. Okay, Soviet propaganda explained to us. Okay, we knew it. Okay, we saw all these pictures, from New York to San Francisco, Washington, so it was known. But when I happened to be in the United States, probably the most shocking for me back then and continue to be three American institutions that makes U.S. America completely outstanding, even compared to many other, even Western countries, not only Eastern or communist and so on. One institution is libraries. Libraries, American libraries, are outstanding. And at least when I came here, so most of them were open to anyone. So you can come, whether it's kind of public library or university library, you can come and you can enjoy, you can kind of just delve into this world of information and just you can do whatever you like. It was shocking and it was enjoying, and this is and the level, how libraries are organized, what kind of literature you have, what kind of access you have to different sources of information, and the stuff that is so friendly and so ready to help and to provide, just unbelievable. So first of all, library. Second is museums. American museums are outstanding. Not all of them, but many of them, including big ones. And so I happen to be, as you are aware, living in Washington. We have here National Gallery in Washington. And that is even fact that this is free. It is not a capitalist approach.
It is not.
Not a capitalist approach, but it's unbelievable that the collection of such quality, such is open to anyone, to Americans, to non-Americans, to visitors, to just the whole world. It's just unbelievable. Even not only in this former Soviet Union or in the current Russia, but in many European museums that have a greatest collection of art of different elements. No, there is some limitations, but not here. So, and the way the museum business, how it is organized, how to give the opportunity for visitors to get this knowledge, amazing. For example, just again, once again, here in Washington, there is a museum of Bible. Unbelievable museum, just by any international standards. And the third institution, once again, is of shocking quality and level, is American Archives. Starting from the National Archive, once again here in Washington, where you can go and you can see Magna Carta or Declaration of Independence or Bill of Rights or Constitution or whatever. Just so the most some kind of important and most probably strongest impact on me was and shock was not the even U.S. economic might, no U.S. military might, or anything else, but just these three institutions that have been developed by American society, by American people, both through some kind of public contribution and private contribution, because many of those institutions are private ones. But they are private ones for public consumption and for public use. So, and this is a very special, very unusual for people who came from the other part of the world with very primitive understanding of the Western society, that private is private and public is public, or state and so on. Just you see how these two sides are working together and complementing to each other, which is not explained neither by communist theoreticians, but even to a very high extent by Western authors, because not everybody understands how they intertwined and how they collaborate with each other and how they produce a kind of additional value from this mutual cooperation.
I've never thought twice about any of those three institutions, so that's really interesting. Thank you.